Della Renner counted out $12 on the land office counter, every coin she owned. She stacked them slow, in the cold, and she did not look up. The clerk slid them back. He thought she'd misheard the price. She pushed them across again. She had not misheard. $12. That was the price of the 1/4 section in Kell County that nobody else would touch, a widow buying cursed ground, because cursed ground is the only ground the poor can afford. And the land broker, Ansel Prewitt, said it loud so the whole office could hear. A dozen men stood around the stove that morning. He wanted them all listening. 9 families, Mrs. Renner, bad water, bad luck. You'll be crawling back out that doorway by first snow. Same as all of them, the 12 men laughed with him. Here is the part he left out. Every one of those 9 families crawled in through the same half-fallen doorway. And not one of them ever dug it clear. 3 days with a spade is work no man does for a house he means to leave. Della looked at that fallen sod. Then she picked up her dead husband's spade. If you've ever been handed the thing that failed for everyone else and been told it was your last chance, this story is for you. Before we go on, do something for me. Subscribe, so a story like this can find the next person who needs it. And down in the comments, tell me the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels tonight. Then stay with me, because what that widow found under 3 feet of sod is the whole reason I'm telling you this at all. Now, let me take you back. It was the spring of 1891, out in western Kansas. The town was Ostrander, a rail stop, a grain house, a church with no bell yet, and a land office that did more crying than praying. Those were the drought years. 4 winters back the rain had quit, and it had not come honest since. The boom counties emptied. Whole townships that filled up in 85 stood dark by 90. Families that came out west with a wagon and a Bible loaded that same wagon and went home east, thinner than they left. Della Renner did not have east to go back to. There was nothing there for her now. Her husband was Thomas. A wheat man, a good one, the kind who could read a sky and tell you what it meant. He'd broken 60 acres of native sod with his own hands, and 2 summers passed, in the worst of the dry, a fever took him in 11 days. She buried him herself, on a rise, because the ground was hers and the burying was too. After that it went the way it goes. The bank took the 60 acres. The team went to pay what the bank didn't. The wagon went too. By that spring she had a boy, a trunk, and 1 spade. The boy was Toby. 7 years old. Quiet the way children get quiet when they've watched a grown-up worry. Toby had cold hands. That was the thing she couldn't shake. All that winter passed, in the room they rented over the feed store, his hands stayed cold. She'd hold them between hers at night and rub the blood back into them, and still they'd go cold again before he slept. A boy shouldn't have cold hands in his own home. She swore to herself he'd have a warm one before the next snow. That was the whole of it. She didn't want much. She wanted a roof her son could winter in. And a door that shut. The spade was Thomas's. Ash handle, worn smooth and dark where his grip had lived. The steel he'd kept clean and honed, the way you keep a thing you use every day of your life. When she held it, she held him a little. It was the last thing of his she owned, and she'd have gone hungry before she sold it. So she walked into the Ostrander land office with her $12 and her boy, and she asked what a widow could buy. There was exactly one thing. They called it the Divide Quarter. 160 acres up on the long ridge north of town, where the land lifts and the wind never rests. There was a Soddy already on it. Built back in 1880, one of the first out that way. And in 11 years, 9 families had gone in and 9 families had come out. The clerk told her the story like he was doing her a kindness. Bad water, he said. The well up there'll turn on you. Last family that had it, their baby took sick. From the well, they say. Wasn't a month before they relinquished. That's why it's cheap, ma'am. That's why it's $12. Everyone in that county could tell you the same. Bad water on the divide. Bad luck on the divide. They'd told it so long it had worn a groove. And here's the thing I want you to sit with. Not one of them had ever checked. Not one had drawn a bucket and drunk it. Not one had asked why 9 different families with 9 different wells worth of luck all failed the exact same way in the exact same house. They just passed the story hand to hand until it felt like a fact. Della didn't know any of that yet. She only knew $12 was $12. Ansel Prewitt handled the paper himself. He was a broad, easy man in a good coat, gray coming in at the temples, the kind of man a town trusts because he's always there and always smiling. He'd been in Ostrander since before the rail came. Every relinquishment on the divide had passed across his desk. All 9. He spread her papers and dipped his pen and talked while he wrote. Friendly, loose, like a man who has nothing to hide because he's hidden it well. You know the joke of that place? He said, not looking up. Folks never even dig the door out. It caved partway back in the early days, and every family since just stooped on through. Crawled in like it was a burrow. He chuckled. No sense fixing a door for a place you'll leave by first snow. So it just keeps caving. He said it as a throwaway. A little joke to fill the quiet while the ink dried. He had no idea he'd just handed her the only fact that mattered. Men like Prewitt say too much when they think they're safe. She signed. The quarter was hers. Then he leaned back and looked at the dozen men by the stove, and he made the most of his audience. Gentlemen, he said, behold the new owner of the divide, the widow and the curse. $2 says the first blizzard sends her packing. He grinned. I'll even hold her old room over the feed store. She'll want it back by December. They laughed again. That easy small-town laugh that doesn't mean cruelty so much as it means nothing at all. Della stood with her hand on Toby's shoulder and said not one word. She'd learned the price of words in rooms full of men. She kept hers. But walking out, she was thinking about the door. A door that caves in and stays caved. 9 families stooping through the same broken mouth of the same house year after year, and not one of them ever cleared it. She turned that over. It sat wrong with her. Because a person who means to stay fixes the door first thing. A person who means to leave never bothers. 9 families, and every one of them had already decided to leave before they ever moved in. She didn't have a name for what that meant. Not yet. But she noticed it. That's the whole beginning of everything. She noticed the thing everyone else had stopped seeing. They moved up to the divide before the cold came. It's a strange country up there. You feel it the moment you top the ridge. The land goes wide and bare in every direction, and the sky sits on it heavy, and the wind comes across the grass, with nothing to slow it down. No trees. No fold in the ground to hide behind, just the long open back of the high plains, and that ridge running along the spine of it. The divide, they called it, because the water that fell on one side ran one way, and the water on the other ran the other. On a still day, you could hear your own blood. On any other day, you heard the wind. And only the wind. The Soddy sat facing that wind. She'd remember later that she felt it before she understood it. It was a good Soddy, as those things go. Thick walls, cut from the tough native sod that the first man out here must have broken by hand. Squared corners. A real timber ridgepole, hauled from Lord knows how far. Because there wasn't a tree for miles. Somebody had built it to last. That was plain even under 11 years of neglect. And there was the doorway. Just as Prewitt said, the top of the entry had slumped in long ago, and the fallen sod had never been cleared, so the opening was low and mean, a stooping hole you ducked through sideways. Della stood and looked at it a while before she went in. Toby went first, small enough to walk through nearly upright. She had to bend near double. Inside it was one main room, dirt-floored, dim, cold as a cellar. A second doorway at the back, plugged and forgotten. An iron stove sat against the wall, left behind by somebody, too heavy to haul off. Soot ran up the wall above it in a long dark ghost, the mark of every fire that had ever burned there. The first thing she did was see to the water, because the water was the story, and she meant to know if the story was true. She drew a bucket from the well behind the house. The rope was sound, the bucket came up clean, and the water, she cupped it in her hands and smelled it, and then she drank. It was good. Cold and sweet and clean, colder than the rented water in town had ever been, better water than she'd tasted in 2 years. She drew a second bucket and gave it to Toby and watched him drink, and it did him no harm at all. It never had. It never would. She stood by that well in the wind with the bucket in her hands, and the first crack ran through the county's story. Bad water. There was no bad water. There had never been any bad water. She'd checked in one afternoon what 9 families and a whole town had repeated for 11 years without checking once. But that only opened a bigger question, and she felt the weight of it settle on her. If the water was good, then why? Why did 9 families leave? Something had run them off, one after another, all the same. She'd just proven it wasn't the well. So, what was it? She got her answer the first hard night. The cold came early that year, a north edge on the wind by mid-October. She built up the stove that first cold evening, banked it good with what fuel she'd hauled, and she and Toby sat close to wait for the room to warm. It never warmed. The stove got hot. She could lay her hand near the iron and feel it throwing heat, honest heat, a good fire well kept. But the room stayed cold. The warmth came off the stove and simply went, pulled away somewhere, and the far corners stayed near as cold as the night outside. Toby's hands, when she took them, were cold again. In their own house, in front of a burning stove. And there was the wind. It came at the front of the house all night, straight at that low broken doorway, and it screamed there. It found the gaps around the fallen sod, and it poured through, a steady cold river of air across the floor, and it did not let up till near dawn. She lay awake and listened to it hunt through the room and steal the heat off her fire, and she began, dimly, to understand. It wasn't the water. It was the cold. That was what broke them. 9 families had lit good fires in that good stove and sat shivering just the same, night after night, while the wind came in the door and carried their warmth away. And they'd blamed the water because the water had a story ready-made, and the cold had none. Easier to say bad luck than to sit in a freezing room and ask why. She lay there, and she thought, I cannot winter here like this. Toby cannot. Not with that door open to the wind, and a person who couldn't answer it would have done what the 9 did. Packed the wagon, told the town the ground was cursed, and left. But Della Renner had one thing the 9 did not, and it was leaning by the door where she'd set it. The next morning she went out and stood in front of the caved doorway a long time, in the wind, turning it over the way Thomas used to turn over a problem before he touched a tool to it. A door you crawl through can't be barred. That was the plain fact of it. You couldn't hang a proper door on a hole like that, couldn't seal it against a Kansas winter, couldn't stop the wind that was stealing her son's warmth every single night. The fallen sod had to come out. All of it, down to the real entry the first builder had made, whatever shape that was under there. 3 days' work, she reckoned, at least. Maybe more, alone, with one spade. 3 days of hard digging in the cold for a thing every other family had looked at and decided wasn't worth an afternoon. She didn't think of it as anything grand. She wasn't hunting for treasure. She'd never in her life heard of anybody hunting for treasure. She thought of it exactly the way Thomas would have. A door that won't shut is no door. Fix the door. That's all. The plainest reason there is. She thought of the two families the clerk had mentioned in passing, the ones before the Well family. She'd asked around, some, in her quiet way, before she left town. One had lasted a single winter and gone east saying they just couldn't keep a fire. Another the same. Couldn't keep a fire. She'd nodded when they told her, and filed it. And now up here in the screaming cold, she understood it to the bone. Of course they couldn't keep a fire. Nobody could keep a fire in a room the wind ran through. It wasn't the fire. It was never the fire. The pattern was assembling itself in her mind, one family at a time. Same house, same door, same cold, same story told after, to save face. 9 of them. She sent Toby to gather what buffalo chips and dry stock he could for the stove, to keep his hands busy and his mind off the cold. And she picked up Thomas's spade, and she set the blade against the packed fallen sod in the mouth of the doorway, and she pushed it home with her boot. The first day was the worst kind of work. The fallen sod had sat and settled 11 years. It had gone near to stone. Rain had packed it, frost had bound it. Grass roots had knit through it till it held like brick. She cut it in pieces the size she could lift, and she carried each one clear and stacked it to the side, and the wind took the sweat off her the second it rose. Her hands blistered through Thomas's old gloves. Her back seized up by noon, and she worked through it. She'd broken sod alongside her husband for 15 years. She knew how to spend a body against the ground. By dark the first day she'd cleared maybe a foot of depth across the opening. It didn't look like much. She looked at it in the last light and made herself see it as progress and not as the little it was. Then she went in and built the useless fire and held her son's cold hands and slept. The second day the ground gave her something. She'd cut down and back, following where she judged the real doorway ought to run, and midway through that morning the spade struck different. Not the packed rubble she'd been fighting. Something firmer. Squared, she got down on her knees in the cold dirt and cleared it with her hands. And there it was. The edge of the original entry. The one the first builder had cut back in 1880, before any of the 9 ever came. And it was nothing like the caved mess above it. It was deliberate. Squared off clean, framed once with timber, a proper doorway made by a man who knew his trade and meant his house to stand 100 years. The collapse above had come later and buried it, and every family since had just crawled over the grave of a good door without ever knowing it was down there. She sat back on her heels and looked at that squared edge and felt something move in her chest. Somebody had built this place right. Somebody had cared. And the story the town told, the careless, luckless, cursed ground story, did not fit the work of the hands that had made this doorway. Those two things could not both be true. She was more certain than ever now that the county had the story wrong end forward. She dug the rest of that day to clear the true entry, and it was better ground than the rubble, and she made real headway. By dark on the second day, she could stand near upright in the doorway of her own house for the first time. She stood there in it a moment before she went in, just to feel it. A door a person could walk through. It made her want to weep, and she didn't, because there was still the third day. On the third day she found the room that changed everything. She'd cleared the true entry down and out, and she'd started squaring back the inside of the passage where the collapse had spread past the doorframe into the wall itself. And there, lo, where the fallen sod had hidden it all these years, her spade went through into hollow. Not dirt, not more rubble. Empty space, on the far side. She stopped. She cleared the spot slow, with her hands now brushing the loose sod away, and she found the edge of it. A second doorway. Small, lower and narrower than the first, cut back into the bank of earth that the Soddy leaned against. And it was plugged. Sealed, filled tight with cut blocks of sod, fitted in deliberate and packed home, the way a man seals a thing he means to stay sealed. She sat there in the cold passage, with her heart going hard, and looked at it. This wasn't collapse. Collapse is random. This was closed on purpose. Somebody had cut a second room back into the bank, and then walled its doorway up with fitted sod, and then, she could see it now, reading the ground like Thomas taught her, the big front collapse had come down over it afterward and buried the whole thing, which meant this little sealed door had been shut before the front ever caved, before the first of the 9 families ever set foot on the place. It had sat here, plugged and hidden, under 11 years of families crawling past it in the dark, and not one of them had ever known it was there. Because not one of them had ever dug. Her hands were shaking, and not from the cold now. She thought of Prewitt in the land office, easy and grinning. Folks never even dig the door out. She thought of the 12 men laughing. She thought of 9 families crawling in and out through a broken mouth, year after year, blaming the water, blaming their luck, cursing the ground, and all that time this sealed room had waited 3 feet away in the dark for somebody willing to spend 3 days with a spade. She'd spent the 3 days. She set the point of Thomas's spade against the fitted sod that plugged the little doorway. She looked back over her shoulder once, toward the main room, where Toby was feeding the useless stove, where the wind still hunted for the warmth. Then she looked back at the sealed door. And she pushed the blade in, and the first block of sod came loose in her hands. The cold that came out of that room was different from the cold of the passage, stiller, older, the kind of cold that has been sitting undisturbed long enough to settle into itself, the way a cellar smells when you open it after a long winter, not unpleasant, only sealed. She held the candle at the opening and waited for the air to move, and it did not move, and that told her something she could not yet name. She pulled the second block free. Then, the third. The fitted sod came out cleanly, each block still holding its shape after 11 years in the dark, dry and dense and perfectly formed, the work of a man who knew what he was doing when he cut them. She stacked them in the passage beside her knees and worked without hurrying, the way she had worked the last 3 days, methodical and quiet. The candle guttering once when she shifted wrong, and then settling back to its thin, steady light. The opening, when she had enough blocks out to duck through, was low. She went in on her hands and knees with the candle held ahead and came up in a room barely larger than a root cellar, 6 feet back into the bank, not much wider than her outstretched arms, the sod ceiling low enough that she could not stand fully upright. But it was a room. A made room, deliberate, the walls were smooth cut, packed tight, the corners squared with care. Someone had taken time here. She stood crouched in the middle of it and turned the candle slow. There was a wooden box on the floor in the far corner, banded in tin, the lid shut. There was a pair of wool blankets folded on a low shelf cut directly into the east wall. There were 2 tins she didn't try to open, a coil of wire, a crock with a wax-sealed lid. The things a man leaves when he means to come back and does not come back. She looked at them without touching them, cataloging each one the way Thomas had taught her to catalog a field before you turned it. See what's there before you decide what it means. And then she turned to the north wall, and the candle threw its light against the slate. It was propped flat against the sod, a piece of schoolhouse slate maybe 18 inches across, and someone had written on it in chalk so many times and wiped it clean and written again that the surface had gone gray with the ghost of all those previous words, but the last words were still there, still legible. She brought the candle close and read them, and she read them again, and she felt the floor shift under her in a way that had nothing to do with the ground. The writing was careful. A man who thought in straight lines had written this, someone who measured before he cut and drew his conclusions out plainly, without dramatics. She could see that in it even now, even in chalk on a slate in a sealed room in the dark. "Wind comes straight at the door," he had written. "No stove will hold against it. The entry faces NW into the prevailing winter wind, and it pulls the heat from this room the way a chimney draws smoke. I have proved this with 3 winters. The cure is simple. Cut the door through the east wall in spring. The east wall is leeward. Any fire set in this room against a leeward east entry will hold the warmth entire. I will do this in April, when the ground softens. E. Rausch, March 1883. She stayed crouched there with the candle tilted toward the slate, and the words assembled themselves in her mind the way pieces of a broken thing assemble when you lay them out on a flat surface and see at last what they once were. Emil Rausch. She didn't know the name, but she knew what it meant. The man who built this Soddy, the 1880 builder, the original. He had understood. He had lived in this room and felt the wind pour through that northwest entry and pull every fire flat and cold, and he had worked it out the way a sensible man works out a problem, carefully, on a slate, with evidence and a plan. He had not called it a curse. He had not blamed the water or his luck. He had written down exactly what was wrong and exactly how to fix it, and sealed this room in the bank to come back to in April. He had not come back in April. And so the room had stayed sealed. And the slate had stayed propped on the north wall in the dark, with the answer on it, and 9 families had crawled through that broken northwest mouth and set their stoves, and watched their fires die, and buried their savings in a ground they named cursed, and gone. Della straightened as much as the low ceiling allowed, and looked at the tin box in the corner. She knelt down and lifted it. It was heavier than she expected. Banded in tin, the seams folded close, the lid shut but not locked. She set it on the earthen floor between her knees and worked the lid up with her thumbs. It came away with a small dry sound, like a jar seal breaking. Inside was paper. Not old paper, not Emil Rausch's hand. This was a ledger, a thin-bound book with a stiff cover, and it had not sat here since 1880. The candle wax dripped over her knuckle, and she did not feel it. She opened the cover. A column of names, a column of dates, a column of figures. She read the first line, then the second. Then she stopped reading line by line and read the whole of it the way you read a thing your body understands before your mind will let it. 9 names. Every family that had ever crawled through that broken doorway was written here, one under the next, in a clean businessman's hand. Beside each name a date, they took the quarter. Beside that a date, they gave it up. And beside that, a figure. What the relinquishment cost the next family. What the spread came to. What the broker kept. She knew the hand. She had watched it write out her own paper 11 days ago, at the counter in Ostrander, while a dozen men laughed. Ansel Prewitt. Della sat back on her heels in the dark of the sealed room, and the pieces came together the way the slate had come together, only colder. 9 families. 11 years. He had not sold this quarter once. He had sold it 9 times, the same 160 acres, over and over, each family paying in, each family breaking against that northwest wind, each family crawling back out and signing the ground away for less than they gave. And every time they left, Ansel Prewitt took his spread. A quarter that failed every season was worth more to that man than a quarter that held. A quarter that held, he sold once and never touched again. A quarter that failed, he sold forever. There was more in the box below the ledger. She lifted the book out and set it on her knee. Under it, a woman's sewing scissors, good steel, the kind you do not leave behind if you have any say. A child's shoe. One. Worn soft. A folded square of oilcloth that turned out to be a Bible, with a family written into the front of it in a careful hand, births, a marriage, and then nothing after 1885. 2 spoons. A brooch of pressed tin made to look like silver, the goods the families left behind, or the goods that were told to them were not worth carrying, cached here. In the room nobody knew existed, behind the doorway nobody would dig. Kept, some of it, she understood, sold again in Ostrander to the next family that came through, at the store, at a price. He knew about this room. Somewhere along the 11 years, Ansel Prewitt had found this back room and made it his own dry cellar for the leavings of the people he broke. But he had never read the slate. Or he had read it and let it stand. Because if he had ever spoken the one plain sentence chalked on that wall, "Cut the door east," the curse would have ended with the first family. And a quarter that could be wintered on was a quarter he could only sell once. Della closed the ledger. She held it against her chest with both arms the way she had held Toby as a baby, and she stayed like that a long moment in the cold, sealed dark. And she did not cry, though her jaw ached with the holding. Then she stood, as much as the ceiling let her, and she blew the candle out, because there was no more to see, and wax was dear. She carried the box out through the dug doorway into the last of the daylight, and Toby was there by the well with his cold hands in his sleeves, watching her come out of the ground. "What's in it?" he said. "The reason," she said. "The whole reason, Toby. It was never the water. It was never bad luck." She looked down the long tilt of the divide, west, into the wind that never stopped coming. It was the door. And a man who could sell a door that killed you 9 times over. The boy did not understand all of it. But he understood her face, and he came and put his cold hand into her free hand, and they stood there together, while the sun went flat and orange behind the ridge. That was mid-October. She did not ride to Ostrander with the box. She wanted to. She lay awake that night in the still cold main room and thought of walking into that land office and setting the ledger on the counter in front of the dozen men and watching Ansel Prewitt's face come apart. But she was a practical woman, and she made herself be practical now. She had a slate that told her the cure. She had a ledger that told her the crime. What she did not yet have was a room that held its heat. And winter did not wait on justice. Winter was coming down out of the northwest with the same wind that had beaten 9 families flat, and if she and Toby were going to be alive in the spring to say any of it out loud, she had one thing to do first. And only one. Cut the door east. She did not get the chance to start clean. 4 days after she opened the box, she was out at the dug doorway, squaring the old entry when she heard a horse. She knew the sit of the rider before she could see his face. Ansel Prewitt came up the tilt of the divide slow, on a good bay, in a good coat, and he reined in a little way off and looked at the cleared doorway a long time before he said anything at all. "You dug it out," he said. "I did. Nobody digs it out." He said it almost to himself. His eyes went past her to the dark squared mouth of the entry, and then, she saw, they went to the second, smaller opening beside it, the one that had been a plug of sod for 11 years and was now a hole. She watched his face when he saw that. She watched something move behind his eyes that was not surprise. It was fear. He knew what was back there. "There's a room," he said. "There is." What was in it? "Old things," Della said. "A family Bible. A child's shoe. Somebody's good scissors." She let it sit. "You'd know better than me, Mr. Prewitt, what all was in it. You put it there." He was 50-some years old, and he had a face that had smiled at a dozen men while he took a widow's $12, and it was a face that did not give much. But it gave that. Just for a second. Just enough. Then it closed again, smooth as the lid of the box. "You've been out in the cold too long," he said, and he made his voice kind, which was worse than the mockery had been. "It happens. First winter on hard ground, a woman alone, a child to feed. You start seeing things in the dark. Reasons, plots." He shook his head slow. "There's no shame in it. It's happened to every one of them out here." "Has it?" "I'll tell you what I'll do." He shifted in the saddle and got businesslike, and this she recognized. This was the counter voice, the voice from the land office. "I'll buy the relinquishment back off you. Today, before you waste a whole winter freezing on ground that's beat better folks than you. I'll give you what you paid and a little over. $12. And call it 18. You take your boy back to town before the snow, and we'll both forget you dug up a lot of old rubbish and got ideas from it. There it was. $18 to bury the ledger, $18 to make her the 10th name in a column of 9. Della stood up straight at the doorway with Thomas's spade in her hand, the ash handle worn smooth under her palm, the steel honed clean. She looked at Ansel Prewitt on his good bay and his good coat. "No," she said. That was all. Just the one word. And she watched him understand that the kind voice had failed, and that the counter voice had failed, and that there was nothing left in the box he carried to offer her. "You'll regret that," he said. And the kindness was gone. "You winter up here, they'll find you froze in the spring like the ground meant, and I'll tell them what I told them about the last one, and the one before. Bad water, bad luck. A woman who wouldn't be told." He gathered the reins. "Ostrander already thinks the divide's cursed. Mrs. Renner, it won't take much from me to have them thinking the widow's gone touched right along with it. Same as the ground." "Then you'd best hurry," she said, "and tell them, before I do." He rode off down the tilt without another word, and she knew, watching him go, that he would do exactly what he said. He would ride into Ostrander and let the story out slow and easy, the way you let out a lamp, that the widow on the divide had gone strange, had dug up graves, was talking of plots and ledgers. Poor thing, the cold gets them. He had 11 years of practice making people believe a thing that was not so. She had a ledger nobody in Ostrander had ever seen, and a reputation that was 3 weeks old. The word would travel faster than the truth. It always did. So she stopped thinking about Ostrander, and she picked up the spade, and she cut the door. She started the next morning at the east wall, the leeward wall, the one Emil Rausch had marked in chalk. The ground had not softened, the way he had meant to wait for. It was mid-October and hardening by the day. She did not have April. She had now. She drove the spade in, and it rang off packed earth, and her arms shook with it, and Toby stood by with his cold hands and carried the loose sod away in a bucket, because that was work a 7-year-old could do, and it made him feel he was fighting the cold instead of only enduring it. 4 days. Emil Rausch had guessed 4 days in soft spring ground. It took her 4 in hard October ground, because she would not stop. She dug from first light to no light. Her palms split, and she wrapped them in strips of the wool blankets she'd found on the shelf and dug on. The east wall was 3 feet of sod and packed dirt, and she took it out inch by inch, squaring the entry as she went the way the old builder had squared his, deliberate, a real door, and not a collapse to crawl through. On the second day she reached through to daylight on the far side, and felt the difference at once, the still air, the dead calm of the leeward, no wind at all where the northwest side had screamed. On the 4th day she had a doorway a person could walk through upright and bar shut behind them. Then she moved the stove. The iron stove had stood against the wall by the old northwest entry since before she came, where every family had set theirs, where the soot ghost climbed the sod in a long black smear that proved it. She dragged it, alone, across the packed floor to the new east side, and she set it right, and she cut a fresh vent for the pipe, and she barred the old northwest doorway with sod and the coil of wire she'd found in the back room, and she shut the new east door against the still leeward air. And that same week, the blizzard came. It came down out of the northwest in the dark on the 4th night, and Della woke to the sound of it and knew what it was, the low freight train moan of a plains blizzard, snow-driven flat and hard as sand. She lay still and listened, and she heard the wind hit the old barred northwest doorway and pour against it exactly the way the slate said it would, straight on, hunting the seam. Any other year it would have found the doorway open and roared through, and pulled every coal in the stove to gray ash by morning, the way it had done to 9 families, the way it had killed a baby the county said the well killed. The east door held still and warm in the dead air of the leeward side. She got up in the black and put wood in the stove, and the fire took. And she stood there, in the middle of the room with her wrapped hands, and waited for the cold to come and steal it, the way it always had, the way it had every night since they came. It did not come. The heat rose off the iron, and it stayed in the room. It filled the room. She held her hand out over the stove, and then, away from it, out toward the middle of the floor, and the middle of the floor was warm. She turned and looked at the sod wall where the frost had furred every night in a white skin, and as she watched, in the new heat, the frost went dark and wet and ran down the wall in thin lines, and was gone. For the first time in 11 years, the Soddy on the divide held its warmth against a blizzard. Toby slept through it. That was the thing she would remember. All the fear of the winter, all the digging, all the cold nights with the boy curled against her for what little heat two bodies make, and the night the storm finally came in full, her son slept through it, warm, his breath not showing in the air above his cot, his cold hands for once not cold. She sat up the rest of that night by the stove, and she did not sleep, and she did not want to. She watched the fire hold. Nothing was spoken. There was no one to speak to. The room said it all by itself, and she listened. The storm blew 3 days and broke, and the divide came out white and hard and blinding under a sky scrubbed clean. And the widow and her boy were alive and warm in the ground that had killed 9 families, and no one in Ostrander knew it yet. She let them keep not knowing until spring. She could have gone in sooner. But a woman with a story and no proof is only a story, and Ansel Prewitt had already been to town with his. She had heard it, secondhand, from the one neighbor 8 miles off who came by in January, that the widow on the divide had gone touched, poor thing, digging up the dead ground, that Prewitt himself said so and was sorry for her. So she waited. She waited until the improvements were made and the winter was survived and the thing was a fact and not a claim. She waited until the county surveyor's spring circuit, when a man named Ferris would ride out to certify what a homesteader had done to their claim. Because that was the law, and a certified improvement was a thing no story could talk away. Mr. Ferris came in the last week of March. He was a dry, careful man with a compass and a chain, and no interest in gossip. And he walked the quarter and measured the broke ground where Thomas had put in his 60 acres and where Della had put in more, and he came to the Soddy and stood a long while looking at the 2 doorways, the barred northwest one and the cut east one, and then he took out his compass and held it at the old doorway and read it, and looked up at the long open tilt of the divide falling away to the northwest, and said, quietly, mostly to himself, "Well, there it is. There what is, missed it, Ferris. Your door faced it. The old one." He nodded down the ridge into the wind that was blowing even then, even on a fair March day. Northwest, straight into the winter wind, and nothing on that ridge to break it for 40 miles. No fire in Kansas would have held in that room with the door pointed there. He put the compass away. Whoever cut the new one east knew what they were about. A man named Emil Rausch knew what he was about, Della said, in 1883. "I've got it in his own hand, if you'll certify that too." Ferris looked at her a moment. Then he said, "Show me what you've got, Mrs. Renner." She showed him the slate. She showed him the ledger. And Mr. Ferris, county surveyor, a man whose whole trade was measurement and record, read Emil Rausch's chalk, and then read Ansel Prewitt's 9 names and 9 dates and 9 figures, and his dry, careful face changed, and he said, "This wants to be seen in Ostrander." Before the register. This week, they went in together on a Saturday, because Saturday was when the men gathered, and Della wanted the men. The Ostrander land office was the same low room with the same long counter where a clerk had slid her $12 back twice, certain she'd misheard the price. The same dozen men were there, or men enough like them it made no difference, the men who had laughed. And Ansel Prewitt was there, in his good coat, behind the counter as if he owned it, and when Della Renner walked in out of the spring sun with her son and the county surveyor, the room went quiet the way rooms do. Prewitt recovered fast. He always did. "Mrs. Renner," he said. Warm, sorrowful, playing to the room. "We've all been worried for you, out there alone all winter. I hope you've come to your senses about that ground. I'd still stand by my offer to take it off your Mr. Ferris," Della said. "Would you read them what you read at my door?" And Ferris, who did not play to rooms, took out his compass and set it on the counter and said, flat as a survey line, "I read the orientation of the original entry on the Renner quarter this past Tuesday. Northwest, straight into the prevailing winter wind, on an exposed ridge with no break for 40 miles. It is my judgment as county surveyor that no stove could have held heat in that structure as it stood. The ground was never the trouble. The door was pointed wrong." He looked up. "That's all. But that's certain." The men who had laughed did not laugh. She watched it go across their faces, the settled story they had all repeated cracking in the light, bad water, bad luck, cracking into this small, true, dull thing. A door faced the wrong way. But she had not come only for the door. She set the slate on the counter first. "Emil Rausch built that Soddy in 1880, she said. "He worked the trouble out for himself by 1883 and wrote it down and meant to fix it and died before he could. It sat in a sealed room in the bank for 11 years with the answer on it, while 9 families crawled in and froze out and called it a curse. She let them read the chalk, passed hand to hand. Then she set the ledger down beside it, and she opened it to the column of 9 names, and she turned it to face the room. And this, she said, is Mr. Prewitt's hand." Prewitt moved for it. Ferris put 2 fingers on the ledger and did not lift them, and Prewitt's hand stopped short of it, and that stopping was seen by every man in the room. 9 families, Della said. "Read the names. Some of them are your own kin, I'd wager, or your neighbors. 9 times he sold that same quarter. 9 times it broke against that door. 9 times he took his spread when they gave it up, and 9 times he told the next ones bad water, bad luck, and never once told any of them the one sentence chalked on that slate that would have ended it. Because a quarter that fails every season paid him 9 times over. And a quarter a family could winter on, he could only sell the once." She turned a page. "And here's the rest. The goods. What your families left behind, the things that weren't worth the hauling, he cashed them in that back room and sold them again over that counter to the next family through the door. There's a woman's sewing scissors, a child's shoe, a family Bible with the births written in." She looked at a heavy man near the front who had gone the color of ash. "Zell, that's your family name in the front of it, isn't it?" 1885. The man Zell did not answer. He did not have to. His face read the ledger for him, and every man watched him read it, and then every man read it in his own turn, one at a time, name by name, and the room filled up with a thing worse than anger, which is shame that has just learned where to point itself. Ansel Prewitt stood behind his counter and looked for the counter voice and could not find it. He tried. "This is, the woman's been out in the cold. You've all heard. She's got a grievance and a wild story, old rubbish out of the ground. It proves nothing." "It's your hand, Ansel," said Mr. Ferris quietly. "I've got 100 of your papers on file across the hall in that same hand. It'll take me an afternoon to match it. You want me to?" And Ansel Prewitt had no answer that held. There was no sheriff sent for. There was no rope, no blow struck. It was worse than that, for a man like him. It was a room full of the people whose good opinion was his whole living, and they had all just read, in his own careful hand, exactly what he was. The respect that let him stand behind that counter and sell the divide 9 times drained out of the room while he stood in it, and he felt it go, and there was nothing on earth he could do to stop it. A broker is only trust wearing a coat. She had taken the trust. The coat was just a coat now. He did not stay behind the counter much longer, that spring. A man can't sell land to people who've watched him bury their family's Bibles in a hole and price them back. The business that ran on the curse broke in that room, in the time it took a dozen men to read 9 names. Della took Toby home to the Divide the same afternoon. She did not gloat. There was nothing in her that wanted to. She had come for the door and the ledger, and she had laid them both on the counter and let them speak, and reality had done the rest, the way it had done in the warm room during the blizzard. She only wanted to be home before dark, and to put wood in a stove that held its heat. Ansel Prewitt came out to the Divide one more time. The following March, a year on, with the wheat greening on the broke ground and the drought's long back finally broken by a wet spring. He came up the tilt on the same good bay, in a coat not quite so good as before, and he found Della at the east door in the sun with the spade in her hand, and he did not get down. "I've come to make you an offer," he said. "A real one this time, $1,100 for the quarter." He said the figure like it was a kindness. 1,100. 4 times what any quarter on the Divide had ever fetched, for the ground he had sold 9 times as worthless. That's more than fair, for a widow. You could go anywhere on that. Somewhere easier than this. Della leaned on the spade. Thomas's spade, the ash handle worn smooth, the steel honed clean, the same spade that had dug out the doorway and cut the east door and turned the 60 acres. She looked at Ansel Prewitt a while in the spring light. "It was never cursed, Mr. Prewitt," she said. "Only pointed the wrong way. I turned it to the sun in 4 days." She set the spade blade in the soft ground. "The quarter's not for sale, and I don't believe your story is, either, not anymore." He sat his horse a moment longer. Then he turned it and rode back down the tilt of the Divide, and that was the last time he came, and not long after, the last anyone in Kell County heard of him at all. A man who could sell a curse could do fine, so long as no one dug for the fact underneath it. When someone finally dug, he had nothing left to sell. The wheat came in green that spring and gold that summer, 60 acres of it and more, on the ground 9 families had called dead. The east door stood open to the sunrise most mornings, because for once the wind could be let in when a person wanted it and shut out when they didn't, which is all a door is for. The stove ticked warm against the leeward wall. The frost stopped furring the inside of the sod, and Toby's breath, that first winter had shone white in the air of the house every single night, did not show indoors anymore. His hands stopped being cold. That was the smallest thing, and the one she'd have dug 10 doors for. The spade leaned by the sunlit door, where she could reach it, because there is always more ground to turn. 9 families believed in bad luck. Not one of them was a fool. They were tired people on hard ground who were told a story by a man they trusted, and the story fit the cold they felt, and none of them stayed long enough, or had reason enough, to spend 3 days with a spade on a house they'd been told to leave. That was the whole of the curse. Not the water, not the ground, a wrong-pointed door, and a true-sounding lie, and no one who stayed to dig under either one. Della Renner stayed. She dug, and the ground that broke 9 families kept her and her son warm for the rest of their lives. If you'd been handed that Soddy, with that wind and that story, and that man at the counter, tell me true. Would you have dug? Or would you have crawled back out that doorway by first snow, same as all the rest? Comment the city you're watching from, and tell me which one you'd have been.